The Life of Frederick Douglass, From Slave to Legend. The man stood before the crowd, tall and commanding, his voice steady but electric. When he spoke, silence fell like a held breath. Many in the audience had never seen a formerly enslaved man speak with such power, such precision, such fire. They did not yet know that his words would ripple across centuries. They did not yet know that this man, once considered property, once beaten, starved, erased, would become one of the most influential voices in American history. His name was Frederick Douglass, and his life was not merely lived, it was fought for, seized, and transformed into legend. He was born into darkness, both literal and historical, around the year 1818 on the eastern shore of Maryland in a place called Talbot County. No one recorded the exact date of his birth. Enslaved children were not granted birthdays, only labor. Douglass would later choose February 14th as his own, a symbolic act of self-definition, because love, long denied, would become central to his vision of human dignity. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was enslaved. His father was almost certainly a white man, possibly his mother's enslaver. That fact alone revealed one of the cruelest truths of American slavery. Violence and exploitation were woven into its very structure. Harriet was forced to work on a plantation miles away, and Frederick saw her only a handful of times in his childhood, usually at night, when she walked long distances after exhausting days of labor just to sleep briefly beside her son. She died when Frederick was still young, and the loss barely registered in the records of the slave system, but it carved a permanent wound into the boy who would one day give that loss a voice. Frederick was separated early from his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who had raised him during his infancy. Like many enslaved elders, she was abandoned when her labor was no longer profitable. Douglass would later describe this practice with quiet rage. After a lifetime of service, enslaved people were discarded like broken tools. Even as a child, he sensed the injustice, though he lacked the words to fully name it. His earliest memories were of hunger, cold, and fear, but also of questions. Why were some people free and others enslaved? Why did white children go to school while black children worked? Why did the crack of the whip echo through the fields, followed by screams that adults pretended not to hear? At around 6 or 7 years old, Frederick was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld, relatives of his enslaver. This move, meant to serve the convenience of white families, would alter the course of his life and American history. Sophia Auld had never owned a slave before. She was not hardened by plantation brutality, and at first she treated Frederick with a degree of kindness unfamiliar to him. Most importantly, she began to teach him the alphabet. For a brief moment, literacy, one of the greatest taboos in the slave system, entered his life like sunlight through a crack. But that crack was quickly sealed. When Hugh Auld discovered the lessons, he was furious. He told his wife that teaching a slave to read would, quote, forever unfit him to be a slave. Those words burned themselves into Frederick's mind. In that instant, he understood something profound. Education was the pathway from bondage to freedom. If literacy was dangerous to slavery, then ignorance must be its strongest chain. Sophia Auld stopped teaching him, not because she had become cruel, but because the institution of slavery reshaped her. Douglass would later note how slavery corrupted not only the enslaved, but the enslavers as well, turning kindness into control, compassion into suspicion. But Frederick did not stop learning. He befriended poor white boys in the streets of Baltimore and traded bread for reading lessons. He studied discarded newspapers, traced letters on fences, and memorized words from shipyard signs. He discovered the Columbian Orator, a popular anthology of speeches and dialogues which introduced him to ideas of liberty, natural rights, and resistance to tyranny. Through its pages, he encountered arguments against slavery that gave intellectual shape to the anger already forming inside him. The more he learned, the more he suffered. Literacy did not bring immediate freedom. It brought awareness. Douglass would later describe this stage of his life as a special kind of torment. Knowledge made him painfully conscious of his condition. He could imagine freedom, but could not yet touch it. The world expanded before his eyes, only to slam shut again each morning when he was reminded that he was still considered property. When Frederick was sent back to the Eastern Shore, his life grew harsher. He was hired out to a man named Edward Covey, known locally as a slave breaker. Covey's reputation rested on his ability to crush the spirit of enslaved men, to turn resistance into obedience through relentless violence. For months, Frederick endured beatings that seemed designed not just to punish his body, but to erase his sense of self. He was whipped, starved, overworked, and humiliated. At one point, he collapsed from exhaustion in the fields and was beaten for it. Even worse, he was denied protection by the law. When he attempted to complain to his enslaver, the system closed ranks against him. Something inside him nearly broke, but something else hardened. One day, after another brutal attempt by Covey to whip him, Frederick fought back. He seized Covey by the throat, and the two men struggled fiercely for nearly 2 hours. Covey called for help, but no one came. In that moment, Frederick Douglass, enslaved, unarmed, legally powerless, stood his ground. Covey never whipped him again. That fight became a turning point. Douglass would later write that it revived his sense of manhood. He was still enslaved, but he was no longer broken. Resistance, he learned, could restore the soul even when freedom remained distant. From that day forward, the idea of escape began to crystallize. Frederick eventually returned to Baltimore, where he learned a trade as a caulker in the shipyards. Skilled labor offered him a small measure of autonomy, but also new forms of injustice. White workers often attacked black laborers, resenting competition from enslaved men whose wages went to their owners. Even when Douglass earned money, he was forced to hand it over. Still, the docks taught him discipline, strategy, and observation, skills that would later serve him well. He also began secretly teaching other enslaved men to read, gathering them in quiet moments to share the forbidden gift of literacy. The risk was enormous. Punishment could mean death, but the hunger for freedom was stronger than fear. In 1838, after several failed plans, Frederick Douglass escaped. Disguised as a sailor and carrying borrowed identification papers, he boarded a train and traveled north. Every checkpoint was a gamble. A single question, a single suspicious glance could have ended his life or returned him to bondage, but the journey succeeded. Within 24 hours, he was free. He arrived in New York City with little money, no legal protection, and the constant fear of capture. Fugitive slave laws allowed enslavers to hunt escaped slaves even in free states. Freedom was fragile, conditional, and constantly under threat. Soon after, he married Anna Murray, a free black woman who had supported his escape. Together, they moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he took the last name Douglass, inspired by a character in Sir Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake. Naming himself was another act of self-creation, a declaration that he would no longer be defined by ownership. In New Bedford, Douglass worked menial jobs and lived modestly, but he was free in ways he had never known. He could attend abolitionist meetings, he could speak openly, he could read without fear. It was at one such meeting that his life took another dramatic turn. In 1841, Douglass was invited to speak at an abolitionist convention in Nantucket. Nervous and unsure, he rose to tell his story. When he finished, the audience sat stunned. They had heard arguments against slavery before, but rarely from someone who had lived its every cruelty and could articulate its horrors with such eloquence. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the nation's leading abolitionists, immediately recognized Douglass's power. He urged him to become a full-time lecturer for the abolitionist cause. Douglass accepted, and America would never be the same. He traveled tirelessly across the North and Midwest, speaking in churches, town halls, and open fields. Crowds came skeptical, some doubting that such a commanding speaker could truly be a former slave. Others came hostile, unwilling to hear a black man challenge the moral foundations of the nation. Douglass faced threats, heckling, and violence. He was beaten, chased by mobs, and denied lodging, but his voice only grew stronger. In 1845, he published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book was a revelation. It combined literary elegance with unflinching truth, exposing the daily realities of slavery in a way no abstract argument ever could. It sold thousands of copies and was translated into multiple languages. But success brought danger. By revealing details of his life, Douglass made it easier for enslavers to identify and recapture him. To protect himself, he traveled to the British Isles, where he spent 2 years lecturing in Ireland, Scotland, and England. There, he encountered a different kind of racism, real but not codified in law. For the first time, he felt treated as a man rather than a fugitive. British supporters eventually raised money to legally purchase his freedom, a deeply ironic act that underscored the moral contradictions of slavery. Douglass accepted the arrangement, not because he believed any human could be owned, but because it secured his safety and allowed him to return home openly. When he came back to the United States, Frederick Douglass was no longer just a witness to history, he was shaping it. And this was only the beginning. Frederick Douglass returned to the United States in 1847 a changed man, not softened by freedom, but sharpened by it. He came back with a clearer vision of what America could be and a deeper anger over what it was refusing to become. He had seen societies where slavery had already been abolished, where black men could walk the streets without fearing capture, where his voice was heard without immediate suspicion. That contrast burned within him. Almost immediately, he made a decision that surprised many of his allies. He would no longer rely solely on white-led abolitionist organizations to speak for him. Though he respected William Lloyd Garrison and others, Douglass had begun to feel constrained. He wanted independence, intellectual, political, and strategic. He wanted black voices to lead the fight against black enslavement. That same year, in Rochester, New York, he founded his own abolitionist newspaper, the North Star. Its motto was bold and uncompromising. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. For a man born forbidden to read, now editing and publishing a national newspaper, the act itself was revolutionary. Running the North Star was not easy. Money was scarce, printers sometimes refused service, threats arrived by mail. But Douglass persisted, writing fiery editorials against slavery, segregation, and injustice wherever he saw it. He argued not only for the abolition of slavery, but for full civil rights, voting, education, and equality before the law. As his influence grew, so did the complexity of his thinking. One of the most significant shifts in Douglass's philosophy came with his reassessment of the United States Constitution. Early in his abolitionist career, he agreed with Garrison's view that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, fundamentally corrupt and beyond redemption. Garrison famously called it a covenant with death. But Douglass began to study the Constitution more closely, reading it line by line, word by word. He noticed something crucial. The word slavery never appeared. He came to believe that the Constitution, properly interpreted, could be wielded as a weapon against slavery rather than a shield for it. This change caused a painful rift with some of his former allies. Garrison felt betrayed. Others accused Douglass of compromise. But Douglass stood firm. He believed moral purity without political action was insufficient. Freedom, he argued, would not arrive through denunciation alone. It required engagement with power. Throughout the 1850s, the nation edged closer to collapse. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 enraged Douglass. The law forced citizens of free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves and denied alleged fugitives the right to testify in their own defense. For Douglass, this was proof that the entire nation had been conscripted into slavery's enforcement. In response, he became more radical. He openly encouraged resistance, declaring that enslaved people had a natural right to escape by any means necessary. He helped run stations on the Underground Railroad, hiding fugitives in his own home. His house in Rochester became a sanctuary and a target. At the same time, Douglass's personal life carried its own burdens. His wife, Anna, shouldered much of the domestic strain while he traveled constantly. Though deeply committed to the cause, she lived largely outside the spotlight, enduring poverty, danger, and long separations. Their marriage, like many forged under extraordinary pressure, was marked by loyalty, sacrifice, and quiet tension. As sectional conflict intensified, Douglass watched events with a mix of hope and dread. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the violence in Bleeding Kansas, and the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision all seemed to confirm his belief that slavery would not end peacefully. Then came John Brown. Brown, a white abolitionist willing to embrace violence, believed slavery could be destroyed only through armed insurrection. He admired Douglass deeply and sought his support for a planned raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The two men met secretly in 1859. Brown outlined his plan with prophetic intensity. Douglass listened and refused. He believed the raid was doomed, a suicide mission that would bring terrible consequences without achieving freedom. Brown went forward anyway. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and executed. The nation reeled. Douglass was devastated but conflicted. He condemned the violence but honored Brown's moral clarity. After the raid, Douglass fled briefly to Canada, fearing arrest for association. From there, he watched as the country plunged toward war. When the Civil War finally erupted in 1861, Douglass understood its meaning instantly. This was not merely a political struggle, it was a reckoning. Yet at first, the Union fought only to preserve itself, not to end slavery. Enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands, forcing the question, what would be done with them? Douglass demanded an answer. He met with President Abraham Lincoln multiple times, pressing him to transform the war into a war for emancipation. He argued relentlessly that black men must be allowed to fight for their own freedom. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., Douglass declared, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. Lincoln listened, carefully, slowly. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. It did not free all enslaved people, but it changed the moral direction of the war. Soon after, black regiments began forming, including the famed 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Douglass helped recruit soldiers, including 2 of his own sons. He traveled tirelessly again, urging black men to enlist, even as he knew the risks were unequal. Black soldiers were often paid less, denied promotions, and faced execution if captured. When the Union hesitated to ensure equal treatment, Douglass confronted Lincoln directly. His influence mattered. By the war's end, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army. Their service shattered forever the myth of black inferiority. When the Confederacy fell and slavery was formally abolished with the 13th Amendment, Douglass did not celebrate as if the work were done. He had lived too long, seen too much. Freedom, he knew, was not the same as equality. The post-war years, the era of Reconstruction, were filled with both promise and betrayal. Constitutional amendments granted citizenship and voting rights to black men. For a brief moment, interracial democracy flickered across the South. Douglass championed these changes fiercely. He supported women's rights, even when it cost him allies. He believed justice could not be divided. Either rights were universal or they were meaningless. But backlash came swiftly. White supremacist violence spread. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities. Federal commitment waned. Compromise replaced courage. Reconstruction collapsed. Douglass watched with sorrow and fury as gains were rolled back, as segregation hardened, as lynching became a tool of terror. Yet even in despair, he refused silence. He continued writing, lecturing, advising presidents, and serving in public office. He became U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, Recorder of Deeds, and later Minister to Haiti. Each position was symbolic as much as practical, proof that a man born enslaved could hold the highest responsibilities of the nation.
In 1882, Anna Douglass died. Her death left him deeply lonely. 2 years later, he married Helen Pitts, a white woman and longtime colleague. The marriage scandalized the public and even some of his children, but Douglass remained unmoved. He had spent his life defying boundaries enforced by hatred. Love, to him, required no permission. As old age approached, his hair silvered, but his voice did not weaken. He spoke against lynching, against segregation, against the quiet resignation he saw creeping into the nation's conscience. He warned that progress could be reversed if not defended. On February 20, 1895, Frederick Douglass attended a women's rights meeting in Washington, D.C. He returned home energized, still arguing, still believing. That evening, he collapsed and died at the age of 77. News spread quickly. The nation mourned, not unanimously, but profoundly. Black communities grieved a father figure, a defender, a living monument. White allies recognized that a moral giant had fallen. Former enslavers and racists, whether they admitted it or not, had lost their most relentless challenger. Frederick Douglass was buried with honor, but his true legacy could not be contained in a grave. He had turned suffering into language, language into power, and power into change. He had forced America to confront itself, not once, but again and again. From a child denied his own birthday to a statesman who advised presidents, his life was a testament to resistance, intellect, and unyielding hope. He was born a slave. He made himself free, and in doing so, he helped bend the arc of American history toward justice. Never perfectly, never permanently, but undeniably. His life remains a reminder that freedom is not given, it is claimed.